This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com. We're going to explore the question that's been put to us whether the Constitution of the United States is indeed a non-Christian document or is it a Christian document? It's hard to know how to approach that question, but there are many avenues that can be taken into it. One of the objections to the Constitution is that the whole making of the Constitution was a coup, much as a person may see in a civil law country where one faction, a political faction, seeks to oust another political faction by force and subversion and manipulation. Did that happen at the Constitutional Convention? Well, I once went to hear Justice Blackmun speak, and he requested at that time a meeting with the students in private, no faculty members allowed. I was waiting to go into the small auditorium and saw an older white-headed gentleman speaking to a whole crowd of young men that were gathered around him. I arrived just in time to hear him say, "Boys, you'd better go in there and ask this Supreme Court Justice a question when he gives you an opportunity, because if you ever see a Supreme Court Justice again, he'll be asking you the questions. This is the only chance you're going to get." Well, I'd never seen the man. Well, I thought I'd never seen the man. The truth is I'd seen him several times on television, a few years before, when he ran as a candidate for Vice President of the United States with a fellow from Minnesota. Now, this man that I saw there, his name was Eagleton, former senator. Well, after the Supreme Court Justice made his presentation, a panel of men were chosen to come and answer questions. The Justice himself was shuffled out and loaded in a limousine with his bodyguards and taken away. Senator Eagleton was on that panel. I disremember what questions prompted this particular reply, but I do remember what he said. He said with disdain that the Constitution was hammered out in a musty, sweaty room on a hot dog day of summer, maybe several hot dog days. He probably was speaking of the day it was signed, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he said, "Don't get to thinking that there's anything special about the Constitution of the United States." Well, I've thought about that several times since. And I finally come to the conclusion, after many years of considering his statement, which seemed rather rash at the time. In one sense, it wasn't rash. Any document that is in the political environment, or produced from the political environment, any writing, is going to be attended by much controversy. As a matter of fact, it can get pretty vicious, as anyone who's been on the floor of a legislative house of one of our states or of the Congress of the United States can easily verify. And I concluded after all that the Constitution of the United States couldn't have been any different, and indeed it wasn't. There are some ugly things in this world that we can watch. Having personally witnessed the making of sausage after butchering hogs, people have likened the making of legislation to that ugly process. It tastes good when it's over if they did a good job, maybe. Maybe it doesn't, but it can. But same thing is true with legislation. It is like shoveling loose manure uphill. You're bound to get a lot of it on you. And the empire of evil, if there's good legislation on the dock, the empire of evil and their minions will be there to fight it. Or the empire of evil and their minions will be there to push legislation that is tyrannical, and good folks will be trying to fight it by political means. Without question, that happened in the hammering out of the Constitution of the United States. In one sense, it was a coup. The people that came there with the constitutional ideas in their pocket, men like James Madison, knew that it was going to take some doing to even get started, because the whole convention began with the idea of amending the Articles of Confederation, which proved to be awful loose, unable to unify the 13 colonies under one standard whereby they could resist the pressure then being placed upon them not only by military forces of powerful countries, but also by economic forces. The idea was to increase the clout of the 13 newly independent states of America. Well, then, folks would say, well, Brent, then we're right, the folks that are against the Constitution and think that it is a product of non-Christian men who produced a non-biblical doctrine and a non-biblical document. But I say, wait a minute, not so fast. The Bible itself was written in the most incredible times of adversity and under the most strenuous oppressions, both politically and economically. Paul the Apostle who wrote so many books of the New Testament, when he came into town as he traveled about the Roman Empire, he seldom ever asked. As a matter of fact, I would say he probably never asked what the hotels were like. He always asked what the prisons were like, because he knew that's where he would wind up most likely, and in most cases he did. If they weren't out to kill him, and they tried several times, the Judaizers did, they, by political subversion, got him jailed on more than one occasion, beaten, and a lot of other worse things happened to him, which he's well cataloged in his epistles. You can read the list there. The prophets of old, before Paul the Apostle, many of them were killed. They spoke from dungeons and wrote from unlikely places like that. The books of Moses were written under pressure while wandering in the wilderness, not knowing where he was following God to. And even in modern times, I've read many good books written by men who have been jailed. And most of them that I've read, for example, have been jailed unjustly. Right here in this country, by the way, and also in places like communist Russia. So to say that the Constitutional Convention was a coup doesn't mean that by itself, standing alone anyway, that the document is inherently evil. If there was subversion there, and I'm sure there was to a great degree, and I can even read about a lot of it, that's normal. And I want to add also that the Constitution, I'll give you a peek at my beliefs, being a common law document, we can observe the doctrines of common law government in it from start to finish on every line and every word and every phrase. And this hasn't gone unnoticed by our own Supreme Court over the decades. They've said it several times. The Constitution of the United States, they've said, and I agree, is written in the language of the common law. And if you don't understand those terms as the common law understood them, then you don't understand the Constitution. But here's the point I'm coming to. Our common law, which is what enables our freedoms in America, our common law and our government is what we call a common law government. It is not strictly a republic, no, that's the form of the government. The government itself is a common law government, not a republican government. Republican government. I mean, even the Soviets had a republican government, as did godless France after their revolution. They called themselves republicans. After the pagan Greeks, that is not the government we have in America. And of course, we don't have a democracy. That goes without saying, but I want to add, too, on this point, real quick, that Greeks, who seem to be the ones that are credited with inventing the idea of democracy, made no distinction between a republic and a democracy. And I find that no distinction is made today. But I want to say, from a constitutional perspective, the Constitution says that each state is provided with a republican form of government, or rather guaranteed one. And that has nothing to do with the substance of the government, and it has nothing to do with the form, the due process that must be followed. It refers only to representatives. That's all it refers to. And if representatives are seated in Congress, then the Congress says that that state that has sent those representatives has a Republican form of government, and that's pretty much unrebuttable. But that's not saying much, as you can see. So the idea, to come back to the question, that the Constitution was nothing more than a coup, something that happened in a sweaty, haughty room in Philadelphia, that doesn't mean that the Constitution doesn't give us, through its words, good government that enables freedom. Well, consider one more example. There are so many, it'd be redundant and cumulative, as the common law says, to list them all. But our Constitution was written under strenuous pressure. The gunpowder of the revolution of the colonies hung in the noses of the men that were there hammering this thing out. And there are men that were there that with whom I did not disagree, or I do not agree, that I know had deeply nefarious purposes and were seeking to hijack the United States into the hands of the Bank of London. There's no question about that. Well, the same thing was true with Magna Carta. Magna Carta, John signed it under duress. Swords were at his throat at the very moment he signed it. He really didn't have a meaningful choice. He could have forfeited his life, I suppose, and the lives of his men and his thugs, I like to call them. But things got to such a pitch in England. He was out of money. He went to the Islamic Sultan of Morocco, who promised him all the gold and silver he needed to fight all the wars he wanted to fight, even against his own barons. But the Islamic Sultan of Morocco said he'd do it under one condition. And this condition is apropos to what's happening today. He said, I'll do it, I'll loan you the money, if you will make all of England Islamic. And for that reason, the barons got pretty upset, and they put together, Stephen Langton, by the way, drafted Magna Carta. They put it together, put it in front of John. The Church of Rome excommunicated Langton for drafting it, and were mad at John for signing it. But Magna Carta embodied the common law as it stood before the freedoms of the common law, as they stood before the invasion of William the Frenchman, the Norman, who lived in France, I should say, who had Romanized England to a great degree. The common law was still in place. But Magna Carta was nothing new. It was an attempt to return to Anglo-Saxon law and government, pre-Norman invasion. And our Constitution, says Supreme Court Justice Wilson, was the same thing. It is an attempt to return us to the common law and government of Saxon England. As a matter of fact, many have observed, and I think it's abundantly apparent, that the government of the United States under the Constitution is more English than England's government. It's more Anglo-Saxon than theirs. They've been Normanized and Romanized since 1066 A.D. Well, let's take another point. It is complained that the men who put together the Constitution of the United States did not have Christian intent nor biblical intent. As a matter of fact, their intent was nefarious, and they sought to put America under bondage to a federal government. And some even say that anything that is not the Bible itself, as the Puritans set things up in New England in the 1600s, anything that's in the Constitution that is not straight out of the Bible is ipso facto false government. Well, first we can observe that the 13 colonies of the Confederation, and even back when the Puritans first settled in Massachusetts in the 1630s and 40s, they had the Bible. They said that the Bible provided the legislation they needed. But throughout their history, from the very beginning, they added their own writings, their own constitutions, their own standards, their own ordinances that came from the pens of men. Even the Mayflower Puritans, who were separatists, they were much more conservative than the Puritans of New England. They drafted what we call the Mayflower Compact, and in that compact are terms that I believe are Babylonian, and I don't believe they should be there, and I believe they made a mistake putting them there. Words like body politic from John of Salisbury. Those are Roman words. Those are Greek words, Babylonian city-state words. Even the word politic from the word polis is about the law of the city, polis, as opposed to our common law, which is in Magna Carta and the Constitution of the United States called the law of the land, or land law. So the Constitution of the United States was not something that happened in America that the 13 colonies hadn't already done, namely, drafted much law to complement and put in force what they believed to be the standards of God. But second, consider this. The complaint is made that these men were evil at heart. Well, I would remind anyone who says that there is not a man alive that is not evil at heart in this sense. He is tainted with sin and imperfection, and as such, in his natural state, is unacceptable to God. The heart of man, said the prophet Jeremiah in the 17th chapter, the heart of man is desperately wicked. Paul the Apostle says in Romans, there is none, quoting the Old Testament prophet, there is none that doeth good, no, not one. They all become unprofitable. They have run from God. The poison of asps is under their lips. Well, listen, anybody that's lived very long and has any sense at all will come to grips with his own imperfections. And if he has any godliness about him at all, he'll confess those, as the Bible says, is the fruit of the Christian man to do that. And anything less is dangerous arrogance. So to pin upon men that they are less than perfect, or just even downright evil, or even have evil motives, does not in and of itself dismiss the Constitution of the United States as a bad, dangerous, lawless document. One of the most dangerous, lawless men that ever lived in England was Henry VIII. If he didn't like his wives, he just cut their heads off. Now, he didn't do it to all of them, but he did it to about half or more, by the way, for no good reason. And he vowed to kill the man, in his own heart, to kill the man who translated the Bible for the first time into English from the original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. He finally got the job done, he did it and made it look like he didn't even do it. William Tyndale was strangled and burned at the stake over in the Netherlands, but he was found out by one of Henry VIII's emissaries who befriended him. He was an undercover agent, his name was Phillips, and then betrayed him, and William Tyndale was murdered. Well, as soon as he was murdered, though, Henry VIII realized the people of England wanted that Bible that Tyndale had translated, and so he took credit for giving it to them, and he began to have it published and passed out in England. By the way, within a very short period of time after Tyndale died. And the Bible has been the center of English religious life, or was the center, for many, many years, and still has a strong influence there, of course. And Henry VIII then finally got rid of all the monasteries in England. He was very politic about the way he did it, but he did it because of the perversion that was occurring within them. Broke the shackles of the Italian bishop who had such sway over England through the Church of Rome. And England's been Protestant ever since. And if that hadn't happened, by the way, America wouldn't be here. Now, Henry VIII didn't have a clue what he was doing that was good. All he was doing at every point was following the impulses of his lusts and his political desires. But as Martin Luther said of the devil himself, yeah, he may be the devil, but never forget he's God's devil, and every person in this world, whether he be of God or against God, belongs under the control and is under the ultimate control of God. God lets evil men out on a leash. Why he does it, the Bible doesn't say. Except to say this, he does it to glorify himself. But I'll come back to my theme at this point. I'm making the point that because men are evil, even if they are given to evil, and if the men at the Constitutional Convention were that way, that doesn't, again, demand that the Constitution of the United States is inherently evil. Let's take another objection. Some people say that the Constitution of the United States has given opportunity for politicians to abuse us, and they point to the shape we're in now to prove that point. Is that true? Is it true that the Constitution of the United States has given us gun control because the Second Amendment was put in the Constitution? I've heard that argument made with great fervor and much research and what is believed to be support. And the same thing is said about the First Amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of petition, freedom of association, freedom of speech. It is said that if the Constitution had not been put in place and these amendments had not been added, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. Well, again, that point, standing alone, doesn't mean that the Constitution is bad. I know that I read the Bible, and after Moses gave an entire law to Israel, and then after he gave a final statement of the law and a final covenant in the book of Deuteronomy, the restatement of the law, some people say, of God, with some adjustments, no contradictions, just some fine-tuning. Moses says at the end of that book, he says, I won't be with you much longer, but I know this is what's going to happen, says Moses. He says, you folks are going to stiffen your necks, you're going to turn your backs on God, you're going to deny His law, you're going to get yourself in such a dither that when morning comes, you'll say, oh, I wish it were night, and when night comes and you go to bed, you'll say, oh, I wish it were morning. You'll be scattered to the wind, your identity will be obscured, nobody will even know who Israel is. Well, all those things did happen, by the way, and it has come to pass. But does that mean that the law of God is given in the covenant at Sinai is a bad thing? Well, of course not. The law of God is perfect. It says in Psalm 19. Psalm 119 lays that out in unassailable terms. And the years and the decades and the centuries and the millennia have proven the good of the law of God. Remember, Christianity and God's people do not rest their existence on morality. No, no. They rest their existence upon provision. Christianity is not a moral order at its foundation. Oh, it produces morality, but that's not what it is at its foundation. At its foundation, it is a provisional order. God provides. Not only does God provide a law that guides us, He also provides our ability, even our will, to do as He asks us to do. It takes faith to follow God, to do what He says to do. And that faith, it says in the Bible, in more places than one, is a gift from God. Well, let me recap or sum up just a bit here at the end. That the Constitution was put together under adverse situations is no argument against it. All good writings are, including the writings of Moses and the whole Bible. In the history of the church, things such as the Westminster Confession, the Declaration of Independence, were written while those men were in the throes of battle itself. That the men who drafted the Constitution were good men or bad men is not really of any consequence, because we are not the government of men, we are a government of law, and all men, in the end, will fail us. The Constitution isn't anything new. The 13 colonies had plenty of laws and had been passing them for decades before the Constitution was put in place. Never forget, said Bishop Ryle, men at their best are still only men at best. As the Bible says, the writers of the Bible were men of like passions unto us, but yet God used them, and I believe He used the men at the Constitutional Convention in like way. This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com.